Yeah, that's all. It's very microphonic.
I don't have my gavel today.
Rest for the wicked.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call Comox Valley Regional District regular board meeting of Tuesday, December 7th to order. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional unceded territory of the Comox First Nation. And today we're reading Article 43 from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The rights recognized herein and under it constitute the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples of the world. And with that, we move on to B, in-camera meeting, and we'll be moving camera following the regular board meeting according to section 91A, C, and G of the Community Charter. Hamir and Grieve, thank you. And all in favor? Anyone opposed? That's carried. And just seeing if we have Director Lee on, do we need to vary the agenda? No, okay. So we'll just continue with the adoption of minutes from November 23rd. Grieve and Cole-Hamilton, thank you. All in favor? Anyone opposed? And that's carried. And then we have delegations. We have Dave Weaver from Beaufort Watershed Stewards, and he should be on the line. Are you with us, Dave? Oh, you're here. Wow. Wow. Oh, there he is. Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
How's that?
So
That's
great.
good. Thanks.
Hold on. We just have, so we've got it moved by Director Hillian, and we'll need a second. Director Grant, thank you. And welcome, Dave.
Thank you.
And I think we're putting up a slideshow for you now.
Great. And thank you very much for having me for the board. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. My name is Dave Weaver. I'm the Vice President of the Beaufort Watershed Stewards, which is a local stream keeper and watershed group out of Fanny Bay. And I'll be presenting our findings from a recent study that I initiated on the hydrological health report card on 4 watersheds in our local area. Just briefly want to acknowledge, as you had mentioned, our jurisdiction is a little bit further south. I want to first respectively acknowledge that the watersheds that we depend on in our area are in the unceded traditional territory of the Comox, Pentlatch, and the Qualicum First Nations. And they are the traditional landholders of that land. First of all, my background is a retired professional forester. Guess I don't need that so close, do I? And I've been retired for about 5 years. I worked about 37 years in forestry in British Columbia, all around the coast and the interior. My background is primarily silviculture and silviculture planning and forestry planning. So I'm not a hydrologist, but I do volunteer for the Beaufort Watershed Stewards, which is the small group of about 30 members in the Fanny Bay area. And I think you have a brochure or outline of who we are. Our main mission is to promote the health and resilience of local watersheds. And we have been pursuing that goal in measuring and monitoring the watershed quality, water quality and quantity over the last 3 years. We do receive funding from the regional district, and this is in part sharing with you some of our findings. And let's see if I can click away. Where do I have to point that? Oh, there we are. So a brief presentation, and these are really the takeaways that I was hoping that the board members can take away from my presentation. There's 3 in total. I can click it again. That way?
Forward button, she said. Pointing to the right.
There we are. Thank you. The first key point is watersheds within the Comox Regional District have potential hydrological health risks. And one of the main take homes from my report that there are elevated risk of peak flows and potential peak droughts as well. Second point is forest land ownership in the Comox Valley Regional District does matter relative to specifically to the rate of harvest that's governed by the laws that govern the difference between public and private lands. And there's one term that I would love that every board member takes away from this meeting, and it's equivalent clear-cut area, ECA. There's a new acronym for everyone. And share that over the holidays with all of your relatives and around the province. And I think that's getting a bit of traction locally, specifically from the flooding that we have had. The last point is that we really need local governments like regional district to advocate for some change in order to address that rate of harvest. I solely believe, and I'll just present my findings, our findings. What prompted me to do this project was primarily two reports. One was a Forest Practices Board report, which is a arm's length organization within the Ministry of Forests. They did a watershed report in 2020. And what they did was look at 5 watersheds across the whole province. One was on the coast in the Memeke, which is north of Campbell River, outside of this jurisdiction. But what they found that there was significant amount of sediment from forest harvesting in roads that elevated the risk to fish survival. And one of the other take homes that really prompted me and to promote to our board to do this study was that they recommended an equivalent clear-cut area percent review would be a really good first step. And so I looked at it as a professional forester and searched on the Coastal Watershed Assessment Procedure Guidebook, another government publication, rather dated. But it looked like it was something that we could achieve at a small outfit, a volunteer outfit. And it was COVID and I had nothing else to do. So I was going to go into the field and I love Google Earth, and you could look at all the images and it looked like I could calculate equivalent clear-cut area. The quote from that guidebook says that equivalent clear-cut area and road density are the 2 primary factors in the evaluation of forest harvesting and the impact on peak flows. Now, this is just a snapshot of one dynamic of the hydrology in our local watersheds. It's a much more complex situation, I think, overall. But anyway, the whole intent of this project that we took on was to try to identify watersheds that had potentially issues that we should be concerned about. Which ones we suspect are in not a very healthy state hydrologically. Therefore, this whole project that called the report card report was born. Now, here's just a quick oblique satellite image of where the watersheds that I was looking at. So it's on an angle. You can see the mountains on the top end of the Beaufort Mountains. The orange is the boundary between public land and private land. And the reason, as I overheard in the hallway, you were talking about the east side of Vancouver Island was actually land granted in the late 1800s as private land. Why is there public land amongst private land? Well, that was apparently the old timers tell me that when it was logged in the 30s and 40s, they defaulted on their taxes and it reverted back to the crown. Subsequently, yes. Subsequently, there's chunks of public land. So we are kind of blessed where we are in Fanny Bay with a little bit of a blend of both land types. For your reference, just so you know where we are, that's the FBI where you see that mug of beer. If you're hydrologically challenged right now, this time of the day, you can look at that beer and that will quench your thirst. So these are the watersheds that we looked at. Mud Bay, which is relatively small, about less than 400 hectares. Waterloo Creek, the next adjacent one, a little bit larger, about 900 hectares. Wilfrid, which is probably the biggest watershed we have, but there's a lot of non-forested, non-loggable area at the very back end because it's very high elevation. And then Cowie Cougar Creek, which is probably the largest area that's manageable forest. Now, the breakdown of public and private land, which I can determine from Google Earth for free, Mud Bay is about 69%, about 70% public. Waterloo is the opposite. It's about 70% private. Wilfrid is 100% private, owned by the major licensees in this area. And Cowie Creek is a blend, almost a straight mix, but about 60% private, 40% public. So that's the blend of ownership that I was looking at. Again, the key concept here is this equivalent clear-cut area. What does that mean? And hydrological recovery. I don't have that much time to go into it, but here's a snapshot. So equivalent clear-cut area calculation is basically, like I say, a snapshot in time. It's this, my project went up to April 2021, and it's basically the percentage of the watershed that's still in a hydrological clear-cut state. So in essence, that once you clear-cut an area like is on the image, it's at zero hydrological recovery. There's no interception of any precipitation at all. It goes straight into the ground and could potentially run off and elevate the level of peak flow, either during the peak runoff output we had in the fall or in the springtime. So that's 0% hydrological recovery. As a seedling plantation grows bigger, you get bigger, more canopy interaction, more interception. And that stand is about 5 to 7 meters in height. We would call that 50% hydrological recovery. So you'd only accrue about half of the area as far as equivalent clear-cut area. And the last slide is actually old growth, which there is very little left within our watersheds, only remains in some of the steep drainages that were out of reach of the 1930s and 40s and has been left. So it's quite minor, but basically that illustrates the ultimate in hydrological recovery, and it's hydrologically highly functioning. So again, that's a lot of stuff. If you want more information, you could read the report. The take home is here what we found out. The first measurement that we performed was the rate that the whole watershed was logged. And it's kind of hard to see on that graph because you have the zoom green thing on the bottom, but you have Mud Bay, Waterloo, Wilfrid, and Cowie on the far right. Yeah, if you can kind of make that disappear, put it over the top of my face, that's probably appropriate. I don't have the mask on, but you can see that Mud Bay is about 24%. I guess I'm gonna have to look at my notes. I can't even read it from here. Waterloo is about 45% of the second growth since the 30s and 40s has been logged. And it can just skip over to Cowie, which is up around 49%. Now the next bars here are equivalent clear-cut area. The orange color is the, I'll just use ECA from now because you know that acronym really well. That's the percentage of the watershed in a clear-cut state. And if I click the next bar, you can see the thresholds that I was able to dig out of the literature, and they're well below the low to moderate in Mud Bay, no issues. You can see Waterloo Creek is sneaking above where the whole watershed of the orange is about 28, where the public is about 22%, and the private is creeping up into the 32% of the watershed in a clear-cut state. We go to Wilfrid, again, it's 100% privately owned, just on the edge of being an elevated concern on 30%. If we go to Cowie, the whole watershed is above 30%. The public is fairly low, but the equivalent clear-cut area in Cowie is about 47% in high risk of elevated peak flows. So it gets a little red circle. We'll look at the other data points that I had. These are the quantitative data points out of 7 that I measured in my report card. The other 2 are road density and road crossings. Easy to pick out on Google Earth Pro. That is the thresholds for kilometers per square kilometer. That's sort of the metric that you measure how many roads are there. So you can see Mud Bay, it's down, it's separated again here a little bit by different colors. Public is blue, orange is private. Private is edging up into fair. The threshold I use, sorry, is from Alberta. There's a recent publication in 2020 for British Columbia, and it's a little bit stricter than this, so my numbers are conservative. You can see Waterloo is getting into poor density of roads, specifically on the private land. Wilfred is not too bad. It's in the fair category. Cowie is well over, again, for its density of roads per kilometer is quite high. Now, if you look at the number of crossings, which the hydrologists say is a concern, it's also obviously a function of how many roads you have. Mud Bay fairly low, only 2 crossings. Waterloo 9. Wilfred being private land, there's 21 crossings, and Cowie is in total 29 crossings, 26 on private land, 3 on public. So we're getting another red star for Cowie. You can see where I'm going with this. So this is the report card. This is sort of my translation of the data that we found over the winter while I collected this information. You can see all the metrics on the left-hand side. So I looked at, we'll just go down Cowie. Mud Bay is about a B+. I used definitions for the letters: excellent, good, satisfactory, unsatisfactory, and failure. Those are all relative to where they are on the thresholds that I used in the study. So get back to Mud Bay is a B+, not too many issues there. Waterloo Creek, not too bad, a little high road density, so I brought it down to a B-. Wilfred, I did witness or identify 3 slides, 2 natural slides, one that was associated around a road. I was unable to prove that it originated from the road or not. So that dropped it down to a C-. But you look at Cowie Creek again, total area harvested was the highest, got a D. Equivalent clear cut area was the hardest, right up in the high hazard. Road density, D. Number of crossings was the high as everybody. It gets a bit of a D. So again, it gets the red circle. Here's the data that we collected for BWS, in which we helped getting funding from the district. We sampled our creeks for the last 3 years. And one of the metrics that we sample is water turbidity. You can see the 3 watersheds along the bottom. The highest again is Cowie at 6 turbidity units. This is usually this is the data we collected from our own data relative to the rain weather station in Bowser. And we just picked out over a 3-year period when it went over 10 millimeters of rain per day. So Cowie's up in 6 NTUs, and I don't know if you're probably fairly familiar with that. You would know this threshold. If it goes over 1 NTU, it's boil water order. And with the Forest Practices Board report, they identified that fish habitat has significant salmon mortality over 5. So unfortunately, Cowie Creek gets another circle. Conclusions, not hard to tell, and it's in red as well. Cowies are most unhealthy. It seems to be pointing in that direction. Evidence kind of looks like it's due to some development factors, but we're not too sure. So we have some recommendations for a group and where we're going to move forward in the future. Cowie Creek, we need a bit more study to confirm the source of sedimentation. It could be due to natural sedimentation, the substrate along the stream channels, or it could be due to the road intensity and the road structures or all kinds of hydraulic measures, but that's our next step. Also, we want to bring on our water quantity monitoring program, and that's what we're just ramping up this year, and we're going to start measuring next year with our volunteers and funding for equipment for that. Because we need some baseline data for what is a peak flow and what isn't a peak flow, specifically with climate change. These peak flows are forecast to be higher and higher and higher, and if we have a watershed that has a high risk to elevated peak flows, that can be a compounding factor. We plan to perform more hydrological report cards like this on adjacent watersheds where we're finding higher sediment measurements. Right now, we're finding Hart Creek. Some of its peak flows, peak sedimentation is around 12 NTUs. And we've actually just started Sable this summer, and we're starting actually this fall finding about levels around 20 NTUs. So I have no idea what that source is coming from. My last bullet to end with is really we're going to have to get on our advocate hat and advocate for some reform of the Private Managed Forest Land Act in order to adjust that rate of harvest or control that rate of harvest. As a group, we're committed to engaging with partners and within government and with local licensees to have those constructive discussions and start that process happening. And I want to leave you with one slide. You're fairly familiar with Langley Lake Watershed. This is from Google Earth. I've circled that watershed in blue. It's about 330 hectares minus the lake. You've had presentations on this before. It looks fairly small watershed, very light footprint. As you can tell, those recent clear cuts are about 10 hectares in size. But unfortunately, you just have to look up the hill a little bit, and Google Earth doesn't mix words or images. You look up the hillside, that's Highway 19 on the right-hand side. If we were looking southwest from Highway 19, that is one continuous clear cut that's 290 hectares. And you can see the amount of development within that watershed, which is probably the trend, which is possibly, we do monitor the water quality on that stream, that river right now. That's one of our concerns. So I want to just end on not that so happy a note, but sort of maybe an inspiring note. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much. That was a lot.
Yeah, it was.
A really, really good work, though. I love to see it presented so clearly, and so that we can really make an assessment of how these watersheds are doing. And I was wondering if you were able to do any information sharing with the private managed forest companies, or was all the data you collected through your own work?
All of the data that we collected for this report was through our own work, yes. And it was strictly Google Earth images and field assessment. It's hoped that in the future we'd be able to tap into the resources that the other licensees have. We're reaching out to them tomorrow, actually, and sending them copies of the report and looking forward to the next steps in that regard. We do have our own GIS software and systems now. We may have access to LiDAR data, which would give us the heights of the trees, which I know the major licensees have as well. So that might be a more efficient step in our next endeavors.
Yeah, and I was happy to hear that you're going to be continuing the hydrological report cards for more watersheds, because I think that's really great and useful for us to do the advocacy that you were talking about when we know which watersheds are more at risk than others. So
correct.
Thank you. We do have some questions here. We'll start with Director Arbor.
Thanks, Dave. Really good presentation. It's been a pleasure to work with you and the Beaufort Watershed Stewards the last 3 years, with some support from our rural grants as well. And I have to say, the very first meeting that I had with staff at the regional district, I had a mild warning about the work of the Beaufort Watershed Stewards, and I think it's becoming evident why. I like that you left that slide there at the end, where we can clearly see some of the public managed forest lands. I believe on the left, I'm not sure if that's part of the Comox First Nation and Qualicum tenure. For those at the board that are not familiar with these kinds of imagery, maybe Dave didn't mention that the darker tends to illustrate a more mature forest, and the lighter tends to illustrate a more recently logged forest. So what a great way to visualize the different levels of practices between private forest lands and publicly managed forest lands. When Dave showed the last clear cut at 290 hectares, I believe, unless someone corrects me, that on public land, you cannot have more than a 40 hectare clear cut on public forest lands in coastal British Columbia.
That's correct.
In terms of this report, this is exactly what I envisioned the value of public involvement in these issues. And absolutely, wouldn't it be great to have this data all the way from Dave started us at the southern end of the regional district. Wouldn't it be great if we went all the way to Black Creek eventually? With these and the report card, again, great tool. People might debate the finer points, but you won't find in the PFC certification of Mosaic or some of the private landowners anything comparable to that. You would probably have to look at a proper forest certification like the Forest Stewardship Council to come anywhere near this level of analysis at the watershed level. After this presentation, I think I would like to propose that we send this report, Dave's report, both to the minister and also to the owners of Mosaic, and we can copy management if we so wish. I might have that as a motion. Maybe the RCA will recommend that we create a staff report, which I would be amenable to. Dave, I hope to continue working with you for a long time. And I like the RPF, the Retired Professional Forester. I want to thank you for your public service.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm glad you picked up on that one.
Next, we have Director Morin.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for the presentation, hot on the heels of another great presentation on watersheds earlier at the Water Committee meeting. Just an observation, I'm finding there's more and more retired foresters coming out to work on watershed issues, so it's great to see. I was, I guess, first curious whether you have been in contact with Cumberland and the work that they've been doing, and also if you have involvement in the BC Watershed Security Coalition, and I'm just seeing all kinds of possibilities here for further collaboration that was discussed earlier today at the Water Committee. And advocacy to the province to actually come up with a process to identify these areas, which of course you've already done some great work on, but to kind of bring all that information together and perhaps get some policy and, more importantly, some funding together to protect these areas. So I'll let you answer those couple questions. Thank you.
Yeah, first regarding the Cumberland Community Forest, for sure, Megan and I have been engaged, engaged for a number of years. I did a presentation earlier today to the Comox Valley Conservation Partnership, which a lot of the local watershed groups are part of. And unfortunately, Megan was on a security meeting at the same time, but we're meeting later on. I know she wants to do similar work within the Perseverance Creek area as well. I'm submitting this work to our Watersheds BC. I think that's our Water BC group, which our BWS group is also, our members are part of that group. And so definitely spreading it as wide and as far as we can. Retired foresters, yeah, I guess we're all coming out of the closet and we have enough confidence now that we can, and enough horsepower in the media to support concerns that we have had for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. I just quickly, it's interesting because I think there's this idea that, everyone in forestry thinks the same way. And I know that I have retired uncles or older, many people in my family who have worked in forestry, and they've in fact all come out in terms of the conservation and protection of old growth. And these are men that have worked in the industry for, 35 plus years. So I think it's a really goes a long way. We talk a lot about listening to people with the experiences, just like we talk about the importance of listening to Indigenous voices in terms of the history and in terms of resource management, et cetera. And I think that there's a lot of credibility to people who've been literally on the ground. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Director Hamir.
Great, thanks, Chair, and thanks to Dave for the great presentation. A question about your report card. I'm wondering, like, the data points that you put together for the collection of all of the information, is that a standardized way of assessing watersheds, or is that, the reason I ask is I'm wondering if this can be replicated, if that data already exists in other watersheds, you know, south of us and north of us, or is that something you kind of put together on your own?
Well, the methodology I used was within the guidebook, the watershed assessment for the coastal guidebook, which is quite dated. 2001 was the most recent update. But there has been recent developments for protocol to assess watershed health by the cumulative effects branch of the Ministry of Forests in Victoria. There was a report that came out in 2020 that Tim Innes just passed on to me. I didn't really know it existed when I did my literature search. And they have a template for assessing watersheds, a little more complicated. One of the problems that I kind of came up against within doing assessing out this watershed report card was the complexity involved. Watersheds are literally functioning systems, and water systems are dynamic and extremely complex. And it's in the literature, it kept on saying over and over again that experienced hydrologists should do it. So it's not a cookie cutter at all. It's not a fill in the blanks and just do it. I achieved somewhat of a watershed report just by focusing on ECA and those 5 other metrics. That's it. There's probably 10 more metrics and a much more diverse thing. So, but having said that, I think it's extremely valuable, as one of the other members mentioned, that it just highlights an area that should have some focus, and maybe spend those big bucks on somebody else with a lot more letters after the name than me to look at it. So,
If I may have one
Yes,
follow-up. I'm curious about the sedimentation levels, and if any of those watersheds actually then do flow into Bain Sound and the impact on shellfish. So I'm wondering too, if the shellfish growers are aware of this report and if they are potential partners for you.
That's a great point. We have reached out as a group, as Beaufort Watershed Stewards, to the shellfish group, and we keep them in the loop. To date, there hasn't been a huge amount of enthusiasm about what we're up to, but maybe this report will highlight that. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Director Hillian.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the presentation. I recently watched The Secret Life of Trees, and so I'm certainly a disciple, but and I know that there's been a significant amount of reforestation that's gone on, but of course we end up with a monoculture replacing a diverse forest. I'm just wondering what sort of reforestation you do see going on in the areas that you're in, and whether you see any evidence that the current government, with the recent report and the actions taken in relation to old growth is doing anything different in terms of the management of our forest resource.
Well, those are lots of questions. We could meet at the FBI and have a long conversation, that's for sure. Do I see, well, in our watersheds, again, they were logged pretty well extensively in the 30s and 40s and have been reforested with, I would say, a straight monoculture of Douglas fir, where there wasn't that before. So that is one issue. They are managed stands. They're spaced quite well, and they're managed to be harvested again. Do they replicate old growth? No, absolutely not. Will they be left to go to old growth? No, absolutely not. So ecologically and hydrologically, they are tremendously altered. And so they, from The Secret Life of Trees, yes, no, the mycorrhizal population below the ground is significantly changed. And so that's not a great thing. What has been introduced by the government recently is a great first step, tremendous first step. It will impact the rate of harvest. It will impact the diversity that's retained. Is it too late? Some people say it's way far too late. Is it too late to say this watershed has been overlogged? That's possible. Or that watershed has been overlogged. That's possible, yes. But these are great steps that the government has taken, but it's not quite enough. Ministry of Forest is responsible for the Private Managed Forest Land Act, just to let you know. And they have, the minister does sit on, and it's responsible for that act. So that's something that is not mentioned. I know that there's a lot going on with public land act around old growth, but not much on private.
Thanks. I'll just add that Director Morin mentioned retired foresters, and we also have retired loggers who are getting religion. Cy Peterson, who's a former longtime business agent of the IWA in this area, has made a film that involves a couple of loggers, including himself, talking to their grandchildren. And the contrasting views and the understanding that perhaps we didn't quite get it right. And so I think there is opportunity for dialogue that really hasn't been there before.
Yes.
And that's at least a positive.
Yes, for sure. I think I think there's a shift starting in society. And I think it's time that, it's probably why the foresters are coming out of the closet. We see that shift and we're clapping our hands and feeling liberated to speak out of it.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Director Grace.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for this. There is a ray of hope here. I can see that. You know, my family came to the Comox Valley as settlers, of course, back in the 1860s, and have worked in the forest industry off and on. So, you know, logging is an integral part of the economy. We know that, but if, you know, we see the knee-jerk reaction sometimes when somebody criticizes logging practice and you're anti-logging. But, you know, that's not what's at stake here. What is at stake is the fact that we have a changing environment, changing climate. The old ways don't work anymore. I have a friend who grew up in California, and there were salmon spawning in the streams in California. Not only are there no salmon anymore, but there's no streams anymore. So, you know, we know what we're facing here. I have a couple of close friends I went to high school with. Both became fallers in the woods, and both recently committed suicide. So there's a lot of remorse there. I mean, the beautiful things they saw in some of their cuts and that, and see it all go down, you know. So I do think that the Private Forest Act has to be looked at. To be self-regulating is akin to self-licking ice cream. You know, I think we have to attack it full on. We have to be respectful so we don't turn the ministry off. But I would think that my dealings when I was in AVICC meeting with Minister Thompson and others was that the culture is so thick, you can't get through. And then immediately they do the knee-jerk thing where you're against logging and all people's livelihoods. Well, I know in the Comox Valley, as far as jobs go, only 2% of the people in the valley are actually employed in logging. So it's not the 1920s certainly, and not even the 1950s out there anymore. So I wish you all the very best, because it's a big cultural shift. I think that's the big thing you have to deal with here, is you're dealing with people's attitudes, and the world has moved on. And if we don't really deal with this head on, you know, we may be not just the salmon extinct, we may meet the next ones to be extinct. So thank you so much for coming forward.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, just anecdotally, the mayors and I were given the opportunity to do a helicopter ride around Comox Valley this summer. And it was quite shocking to see the amount of logging in our area. And I know you can look at Google Earth, but to see it sort of all at once in person was, yeah, it was unpleasant surprise. And I just want to let you know that we are doing a lot of advocacy. The regional district has had many meetings with Flynn Rowe, with the Ministry of Environment, with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, all quite recently regarding this issue and changes to Private Managed Forest Lands Act. We've participated in the most recent Forest and Range Acts review, and have given submissions for that. All the while talking about the need to look at the other act as well, because already there's quite a discrepancy between what happens on Crown land and what happens on private managed forest land. And now they're going ahead and changing even further the restrictions on Crown lands. But yet the Private Managed Forest Land Act is still untouched, and they say that they won't be looking at it again till 2023. So just so you know that it is within our sphere of awareness, and we are working on it. Through the Village of Cumberland, we've put in multiple submissions about the Private Managed Forest Land Act as well. And Mayor Baird has talked to 15 other mayors on the island who have similar issues with my private managed forest, and signed on to meet with the Prime Minister regarding that. But we were denied a meeting with him, the group of mayors. But we're going to continue to advocate and see if we can get some change happening. But having this data is really important for those conversations. And as you said, that baseline data to tell what impacts these forest practices are having is really key. And across the board, we know that local governments can't do that alone, that we need the volunteer groups to help gather that data. And Comox First Nation is and their guardian program is helping with some of that, especially around the Solom watershed. But we know we need it so much more. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for your work.
Okay, thank you. Just a quick one. Mm-hmm. The Private Managed Forest Land Act was reviewed in 2019.
Yes.
And that review is online if you ever need it.
Yes, and we did give a submission from the regional district at that time as well. Yeah. Still all of it's outstanding.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And I can appreciate their helicopter ride, but again, my report is try to quantify that rather than
yes. Yeah.
Just be shattered by it. That's all.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. So on receipt, all in favor? Anyone opposed? And that's carried. Thanks again. Have a good evening.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So we'll move on to reports. We have Committee of the Whole from the Elected Officials Forum on November 30th. McCollum and Grant, thank you. Any further discussion about that forum? I think, am I correct, staff, that we're going to have a report coming back from that Transportation Elected Officials Forum?
Yes, that's correct. Staff will come back with a number of initiatives that may be possible for the board to consider or already are in play that address some of the issues and ideas that came through from that forum. So that report will be coming to you shortly.
Great, thank you. All right, and that's a vote of full board. All in favor? Anyone opposed? And that's carried. We're on to item 2. It's the audit service plan for year end. Grant and Warren, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair and Directors. And Kevin Duval is here, acting CFO for the Comox Valley Regional District. He will present this plan for you and answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Russell. Through the chair to the directors, good afternoon. So in front of you is the audit service plan for 2021 for your information. This audit service plan or similar audit service plans have been presented to you in past years, and this just gives you a sense of the anticipated scope and approach that we are intending to undertake as part of that audit review. MNP had recently been awarded a new 5-year contract through an RFP process earlier in 2021. And so basically what's in front of you today is kind of reflected based on those conversations and that process. They did come into the office initially on the 8th and 9th of November to do a bit of an interim audit to kind of get prepped. And then they will be back in the office mid-March to kind of undertake their year-end field work. And then we anticipate that there will be a presentation of the year-end statements to the board sometime in May. The rates that are noted in the audit service plan are certainly in line with what was quoted through the RFP process. And again, we just wanted to provide the board some information on some of the key items that will be kind of coming forward that staff has already certainly been putting its mind to, certainly with respect to asset retirement obligations, which we've certainly been noting to the board before. That will be a significant part of the finance team's work plan in the coming year. We have been afforded some extra time due largely to the pandemic, so some of the deadlines have shifted at least a year. But we just certainly want to be setting the stage as to kind of what our strategy will be towards moving to policy development implementation of that over the next year. And we'll certainly be bringing our new CFO up to speed as to kind of where we're at, kind of what, be speaking with her around what the game plan is. So perhaps I'll leave it at that and certainly welcome any questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Are there any questions? Nope, I don't see any. Great job, Kevin. All right, so we're on receipt. Let's vote to the full board. All in favor? Anyone opposed? That's carried. Thank you. Next, we have the grant status report. Grant and McCullum, thank you. And I'll pass it to staff.
Thank you very much. And Kevin remains at the table to comment on the grant status report and answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Russell. Again, through the chair to the director. So yeah, no prepared statements for this. Just this is brought forward to you on a quarterly basis for your information, and I'm certainly available to answer any questions you may have.
Okay. We do see some questions coming up here. Where are we starting with? They're just numbered. Oh, Director Hamir, there we go.
Thanks, Chair. Just a question about the grant for the Community Resiliency Investment Program for the Fire Smart. Are we aware of when we might hear back about that?
Through the chair to Director Hamir. So based on kind of the timing last year, because this is something we have, applied for in the past. So this year we heard about February. So that's about the anticipated timeframe. So at this point, we're certainly keeping it in mind with respect to our upcoming financial planning. But as you're likely aware, we don't actually put grants within our financial plans until we know we have some, pretty strong assurance that we will be successful. So what we'll intend to do is if we do find out kind of in that February timeframe, then we'll kind of make sure it gets included in the financial plan before we bring the recommended budget forward.
Great, thank you. Director Hillian.
Thank you, Chair. Regarding the UBCM Strengthening Community Services grant, do you know if there's a fixed deadline in which that money must be spent, and if there's any way of that being extended?
Through the chair to Director Hillian, I might actually tap Alana Maladley to speak to that.
Yep, that would be correct. Thank you, Alana, if you can provide some insight.
The reason I ask is because it came up at the Coalition to End Homelessness meeting that they're a bit slow getting going. And
through Madam Chair to the directors, correct on both fronts. We've got a looming deadline and we've been slow to get going for a couple of reasons. So the money needs to be spent within 1 year of the announcement, which was July of 2021. And so we've got just that very short window to complete the activities that we identified in our budget and our grant application. Anecdotally, we have heard from a number of jurisdictions that they have sought extensions because of the complexity of the work that folks are trying to tackle. So although we haven't made that request yet, we are aware that others have. But I would want to say that we did struggle in the beginning to think about how we could spend the dollars and relative to our application. And there were a few factors at play, and I know that this board table is aware of them, not the least of which is the continuing impacts that we are seeing with the pandemic. But we are, I would suggest, in a very good place now to make some forward movement. And as you know, we're working really closely with City of Courtenay staff as Courtenay Council considers the range of options that they have in front of them regarding the Connect Warming Center. Most of the money in that grant is to be spent on either Connect or a permanent emergency shelter. So, $900,000 of the just over $1 million is for that purpose. The other activities were underway, working closely with community partners. We followed up with the Walk With Me project folks following their presentation to you. Perhaps that was just last month, to talk about some of the stigma, anti-stigma work that we'd like to do. So those pieces are all flowing quite well.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's certainly a desperate situation. I understand that there are challenges even getting staff, as we're finding in many areas of community life these days. But I appreciate that you're on top of it, and I'll just express my hope that a different location is found for a shelter that we could translate into a more permanent facility. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Moran.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I mean, I'm just really hoping that an extension can be granted on that particular grant, because I know other grant funders have been giving extensions because of the complications of COVID and staffing for the programs, and even things like reporting back requirements and things like that. So it's been really difficult in this area to find staffing, and I would hope that, you know, we don't lose out or get knuckles wrapped because of that, those mitigating circumstances. So thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any further questions. So we're on receipt of the grant status report, the vote of the full board. All in favor? Anyone opposed? That's carried. We're on to item 4, the parcel tax roll review panel. Grant and Cole Hamilton, thank you.
Thank you. And Kevin DeVal is here to answer any questions if you have them with respect to what a parcel tax roll review panel is, but we do have a resolution for your consideration.
Okay, are there any questions for Kevin? Director Grave.
I'm just wondering, was Director Lee from Area D invited to this meeting?
She
Just
was, yeah.
because-
We did expect her to join, but she didn't.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any further questions? Okay, on receipt. All in favor? Anyone opposed? That's carried. First from Director Hillian and second from Director Hamir for the recommendation. And that's that we authenticate the parcel and frontage tax roll. So vote the full board. All in favor? Anyone opposed? And that's carried. Thank you. So we're on to item 5. It's the chair, vice chair remuneration. Grant and Grieve, thank you. And this is just the annual agreement between the vice chair and myself for the added work that she does as vice chair, and the co-chairing of the Comox Strathcona Waste Management Board. Any questions? Okay, it's a vote of the full board. All in favor? Anyone opposed? That's carried, and there's a recommendation. Director Cole Hamilton and seconded by Moran. Any further discussion? It's a vote of the full board. All in favor? Anyone opposed? And that's carried. Thank you. On to item 6, the Denman and Hormia Islands high-speed internet Ascent voting results. Hillian and Grant, thank you. And I'll pass it over to staff.
Thank you very much, Chair and Directors. And Jake Martins, General Manager of Corporate Services, is here just to explain the report and the results and answer any questions.
Thank you, Russell, and through the chair. On November the 27th, Ascent voting was conducted on Denman and Hornby Islands for bylaws numbers 672, 673, and 678, which relate to the Denman and Hornby Islands high-speed internet contribution service, the high-speed internet loan authorization bylaw, and the high-speed internet capital contribution agreement. Following verification, the official results were 1,192 ballots cast in favor and 81 ballots opposed, which equates to 94% in favor. With that definitive result, the board may now consider adoption of the 3 bylaws referenced. And it is noted that voter turnout was estimated around 55%. There's a few other stats provided in the report, but I'd be pleased to answer any questions in regards to the proceedings or the bylaws in general.
Great, thank you. Yeah, a good turnout and definitely an overwhelmingly positive result. Any questions? I don't see any. So we're on receipt. All in favor? Anyone opposed? That's carried. And that takes us into bylaws and resolutions for adoption. The first one is bylaw number 672, and that's the Internet Contribution Service Establishment bylaw for Denman and Horby. Grieve and Cole Hamilton, thank you. And is there any further discussion? It's a vote of the full board. All in favor? Anyone opposed? And that's carried. We're on to item 2, which is the Internet Loan Authorization Bylaw 673. Grant and McClellan, thank you. Again, both full board, all in favor? Anyone opposed? And that's carried. And the third one, still relating to Denman Hornby, is the Internet Capital Contribution Agreement Authorization 678. Grant and Cole Hamilton, thank you. All in favor? Anyone opposed? And that is carried. Thank you very much. We're on to new business. We have Municipal Finance Authority of BC appointment of member. Grant and Grieve, thank you. I'll pass it to staff.
This is a regular request of the Municipal Finance Authority for you to appoint your director. And so just if you have any questions about the process or otherwise, staff are here for it. Otherwise, the requested action includes you identifying the director and alternate.
Okay. So is there any questions before we move off receipt and make an appointment? Oh, Director Cole Hamilton? Oh, okay. So all in favor of receipt? Anyone opposed? That's carried. There's a requested action. Director Cole Hamilton?
I want to nominate Councillor McCollum to continue as our representative.
Okay. Are there any more nominations?
Just that we need an alternate as well.
Right, an alternate. Okay, Director Hillian.
It's one continuous sentence, so I was just going to suggest that Director Grieve be appointed as the alternate.
Okay, just make sure that both of them accept those appointments. Yes, McCollum and Director Grieve.
If I just may add on this, my time at the authority was extremely enlightening and interesting, and I certainly hope that Director McCollum is afforded the opportunity to shine in this role, because when it comes to the actual board of directors, and I think I said this last year, and I do believe that Mayor Andy Adams is one of the trustees, on the actual executive of this. But if you look around the executive, there is absolutely nothing even remotely resembling any equality there. It's all the old boys network, and I'm just hoping that when the time comes, we can elect one of our own to the actual trusteeship of the executive, because I think it's very important. So no pressure, no pressure.
Thanks for the vote of confidence, Director Grieve. That's great. Let's hope that that does happen. So does somebody want to make the full motion then? Director Cole Hamilton?
Are we good?
Yeah.
We could try it again.
Okay, that's Director McCollum be the primary appointee and Director Grieve be the secondary to the Municipal Finance Authority. Any further discussion? Okay, all in favor? Anyone opposed? Oh, Director Hillian.
I was just noting, Chair, that the motion includes the remuneration expenses section, just for the record.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so that passed unanimously, and we will move in camera. Thanks so much.